Hello, my dear Anatomy and Physiology 1 lab students. I'm going to create a few videos on the upper limb muscles. One thing to keep in mind is at the end of the slide deck, you'll see the charts for the origins and insertions and actions of all the various muscles that you are responsible for. You may print off the slides this time with the images because I managed to find all kinds of open source images that have a Creative Commons license, in addition to many of the images that come in your OpenStax Anatomy and Physiology free textbook as I list here. The way to go about watching and studying the muscles with the help of my videos is to take notes. And what I suggest is that you take notes onto the slides as you listen to my video. I've left enough space on each one of the slides to where you can take notes onto the slides themselves. I left quite a bit of space next to the muscle pictures so that you yourself can add origins, insertions, and actions with the help of the charts that are at the end of the slide deck. And you could add some of the tips that I list so that it'll be easier for you in lab to keep up with identifying the muscles on the models and then memorizing all the origins, insertions, and actions. So here we go. The way I will present the upper limb muscles to you is by first discussing the muscles in the brachial area and then discussing the muscles in the antebrachial area. In other words, we'll take a closer look at the muscles on the anterior surface of the humerus than the posterior surface of the humerus. And then we'll do something analogous with the forearm. In the case of the forearm, we're also going to be looking at the muscles that sit most superficial on the anterior side and posterior side, and then the muscles that sit deeper on the anterior and posterior side. So we have quite a bit to do. The muscles we're going to take a closer look at in the brachial area on the anterior side are going to include the biceps brachii, the brachialis, and there's actually a third muscle which is not shown here. That's the brachioradialis. It actually covers the forearm bones primarily, but it does originate from the humerus and partially covers the humerus. And then on the posterior side of the humerus, we have the triceps brachii. So before we look at the origins and insertions and actions of each one of these muscles, I'd like to point out to you that a number of muscles or even muscle groups will have the, the suffix seps in them, which refers to, think of the word cephalad, there we go. That always refers to head, right? So when a muscle has the suffix seps in it, it implies that it's going to have more than one head or more than one belly. So let's take a look at the biceps brachii. First of all, the name says that it's in the brachial area. That makes it easy. And biceps means that it has two heads. And you can easily see here these two heads, or these two heads lead to two bellies. On the other hand, on the posterior side of the humerus, we have the triceps brachii, and it actually has three heads or three bellies. Actually, I just pointed to just two of them, sorry. The third belly is a deeper and a little harder to see, but we will on other pictures. So keep that in mind. It's also really important for you to always name this muscle as the biceps brachii and not just biceps. Same with this muscle, you must specify it's the triceps brachii. You're going to see that there are other muscles in the body that start with biceps, or a group of muscles that start with triceps. Okay, so make sure that you're always very specific in the naming of the structures in this course. You know that by now. I think we're all very familiar with the location of the biceps brachii. It's a pretty superficial muscle that bulges nicely when we flex our forearm or we flex at the elbow. Remember, when you express the actions of muscles, you can do that in two ways. You can talk about for instance, in this case, we're talking about flexion. You can talk about flexion of the joint, right? So you'd say flexion at the elbow joint, or you can specify the bones or the region of the body of the skeleton that is moving. So you could say flexion of the forearm or the forearm bones, right? So um, keep that in mind, that you're very specific about where exactly the action occurs. But the biceps brachii has another important function that it tends to do at the same time as it flexes the forearm, and that is supination. Remember, supination is what you do when you um, rotate your forearm to where you can hold a bowl of soup. So literally the radius will move from a crossed over position um, over the ulna when we're in pronated form, and when we go into supinated form, your radius and ulna sit side by side. Here we see a really nice image showing the biceps brachii with its two bellies, or you could say its two heads, totally isolated. So these are the two origins here. Excuse me, and here is the insertion. So the origins are going to be the coracoid process of the clavicle. Remember, that's that raven's beak right here. And then also there's going to be an origin just superior to the glenoid cavity, just above it somewhat. And then it's going to insert onto the radius, and more specifically the radial tuberosity. Because of these origins and this insertion, clearly when the muscle contracts, remember you can do that by putting the palm of your hand onto its origins and the fingertips onto the radial tuberosity, and then, you know, curl the fingers. That's going to move the radius to where flexion at the elbow occurs. And of course, the ulna tags along with it to where we see that the whole forearm is flexed, I should say. But as I mentioned, the biceps brachii does flexion at the elbow much better in supinated, in the supinated form of the forearm, meaning when you're holding a bowl of soup, that's when you tend to flex with the biceps brachii the best. Now, some anatomists argue that the biceps brachii is really not the best forearm flexor. In other words, some people argue that it's the brachialis, the muscle that we're looking at here, that is the main prime mover for elbow flexion. We're going to say for this lab that both the biceps brachii and the brachialis can function as agonists for flexion of the forearm, or you could say flexion at the elbow. This is a smaller muscle and it's a deeper muscle. It's hard to see the brachialis on many images because the only way you can see it if the biceps brachii is removed. On the models, what you could do is look sideways onto the arm model, and then you will see this muscle. We'll see it better on the next image. So here we see the brachialis isolated with the more superficial biceps brachii removed. And notice that it actually originates from the humerus. It looks like it's more of the medial surface of the humerus, but it really should be the distal end of the humerus on the anterior side. And then it inserts not onto the radius, which is what the biceps brachii does, but it inserts onto the ulna, and more specifically, the olecranon process of the ulna. So it is responsible when it contracts to move the ulna to where flexion can occur at the elbow. Of course, the radius tags along. Once again, some people consider the brachialis as the agonist for forearm flexion. My apologies. We're going to assume in this lab that the biceps brachii and the brachialis can both function as prime movers or agonists of elbow flexion or flexion of the forearms. Remember that the biceps brachii does it best when it is in the supinated form. So we consider the biceps brachii also a muscle that functions in supination. There's another muscle that sits deep on the anterior surface of the humerus, and it is called the brachioradialis. A nice muscle to remember again, because of course its name tells you where it originates and where more or less it inserts. The brachioradialis is that muscle that you can very easily see on the anterior surface of your forearm near your elbow joint. So what I'd like for you to do for a second here is place your forearm as you're sitting down watching this video next to you on the table, on the counter, or wherever you're sitting, palm up, doesn't matter which one. And maybe you can pull up your sleeve if you're wearing a shirt with sleeves, and then look at the antecubital area, right? Which is the little hole of your elbow area right there. And then on the thumb side, the radial side, especially if you squeeze your fist really hard, you should, for some of us who are more muscular, see on the radial side a nice muscle bulging on that thumb side, and it bulges kind of laterally. When we look at the slides and the muscle models in the future, you will recognize it pretty quickly. It's going to be one of your landmark muscles. So here it is. It forms that little bulge there on the lateral surface of the forearm. So one of the things you're going to have to keep doing when you're studying with these slides is reminding yourself, okay, which arm am I looking at, and what is the direction of the arm? So first of all, I'll help you out for now, but for future slides, I'm not going to keep doing that. This is the anterior surface. All right. And secondly, since this is your brachioradialis and it inserts into the radialis, into the radial bone somewhere, we'll discuss where exactly in just a moment, then you know that the thumb must be over here, right? And that means that this is going to be the lateral side, and this is going to be the medial side of the arm. If this is the lateral side of the arm, or you could say that is the thumb side of the arm, then you know that this must be the left forearm. I hope all of you are in agreement with that. Let's double check. So it's anterior. We see that this is lateral because we see the brachioradialis here. So this is the radius, therefore the thumb must be here. If I lay my arm in front of me in the same direction as the picture, it tells me that that is my left forearm. So keep doing that. So notice that here is your antecubital area. Notice that little letter V that is formed here. Let me use a different color because that is going to be really important for you to keep looking for. So here's that letter V. And as we study these other muscles, notice how they follow pretty much parallel one arm of our letter V. And the other arm of our letter V is formed by the brachioradialis muscle. As I said, this is going to be very much a landmark muscle because it's going to separate these muscles on the anterior surface from the muscles on the forearm that are on the posterior side. Now you might go, well, I can tell what is posterior and anterior on the forearm. Well, not so fast, because when this forearm starts to pronate, it becomes very difficult for you to determine what is really posterior and anterior anymore. And therefore, we can use this muscle to separate those posterior forearm muscles from the anterior forearm muscles. You'll see. Okay, let's come back to our brachioradialis, and we'll see that with the help of our bottom picture here, that it's going to originate again from the distal end of the humerus, but more laterally, a little bit more laterally, right? And then it's going to cover most of that radius. So it goes all the way to the styloid process, not of the ulna, but of the radius. From there, the name brachioradialis, right? That's that little point here that is nearby where the wrist is formed. And it's this part here that gets kind of bulgy, especially when you form a fist. So this muscle is going to again play a role in flexion at the elbow because it crosses the elbow joint right here. Remember, whatever joint a muscle crosses, it's going to impact movement in that joint. The movement or the action of flexion is not going to be as significant, and therefore we would consider this more of a synergist and stabilizer of the flexing of the elbow joint. Okay, so we finished the anterior compartment of the humerus, which I referred to as the anterior brachial muscles, basically. Now we can take a look at the posterior compartment, and we're only dealing here with one big muscle called the triceps brachii. As the name says, it's going to have three heads or three bellies. Let's take a look at that. Well, before we move on, since it sits on the opposite side of the biceps brachii and the brachialis, and even the brachioradialis, you can already anticipate that it's going to be a major antagonist for those muscles. So the long head actually originates from the scapula, again around the glenoid cavity, very similar to the biceps brachii. But while the biceps brachii originated from the superior lip of the glenoid cavity, or you could just say just superior to the glenoid cavity, the biceps brachii is going to originate from the interior lip of the glenoid cavity because it sits more um, posterior on the humerus, so that makes more sense. While the other heads are going to originate from the humerus itself, and then they all merge and create one insertion. So here we have our, three origins, and then we have one common insertion. And the insertion is going to be onto that ulna, not the radius. Remember, the radius is always on the thumb side. Here's the thumb, and so this is the radius here. What do we have right here? Oops, I'm sorry, let's use a pencil here. What do we have right here on the posterior proximal end of the ulna? That is where you have the olecranon process of the ulna. And of course, therefore, when this muscle contracts, it's going to bring that forearm back to anatomical position, which we refer to as extension at the forearm, or you could say extension of the elbow. Either way, elbow joint, right? Either way is fine. And that makes it a major antagonist for the muscles on the anterior surface of the humerus. So the agonist for forearm extension is considered to be the triceps brachii. By the way, a little story here. One of my best friends actually tripped and fell in her living room while holding a glass of water in her hand and fell right on top of her elbow. It snapped her olecranon process. And of course, what does that impact, therefore? It impacted her biceps brachii. So major surgery and lots of physical therapy, but she's slowly but surely recovering. But things like that happen unexpectedly. And so this wraps up our discussion of the arms of the brachial region. We discussed the biceps brachii, which unfortunately on this diagram is very misspelled. Deeper to it, which is not illustrated, I'm going to fill it in here real quick. Right about here, we would have the peeking out here from underneath, we would have the brachialis, right? Oops, brachialis. Here we can see the brachioradialis, which still starts from the very distal end of the humerus, right here. On the posterior side, we have the triceps brachii. When we studied the head, neck, and trunk muscles, we were already introduced to the deltoid. You can consider it to be part of the arm muscle or the brachial region muscles as well. After all, it grabs onto the deltoid tuberosity. Okay, so now we're ready to move on to the forearm muscles.